The best way to learn a language? Immersion, living where the language is spoken and using it every day. But if that's not in the cards for you this year, you can still learn a language the second best way, and that's with Babbel. Be a better you in 2024 with Babbel, the science-backed language learning app that actually works. Don't pay hundreds of dollars for private tutors or waste hours on apps that don't really help you speak the language. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons are handcrafted by over 200 language experts to help you start speaking a new language in as little as 3 weeks. Babbel's designed by real people for real conversations. Babbel's tips and tools are approachable, accessible, rooted in real-life situations, and delivered with conversation-based teaching so you're ready to practice what you've learned in the real world. For instance, I've been using Babbel's convenient courses to help me learn basic conversational skills in German while I'm getting ready for a little trip I'm planning. It's not a language I'd ever studied before, but I find the lessons really easy and kind of like hand-holding me through learning a completely new language to me. And it's reassuring to know that with the help of Babbel, I'll be able to greet people, order food, and ask for directions without having to consult language apps while I'm in Deutschland. I'm still learning. Studies from Yale, Michigan State University, and others continue to prove Babbel is better. One study found that using Babbel for 15 hours is equivalent to a full semester at college. Babbel has over 16 million subscriptions sold. Plus, all of Babbel's 14 award-winning language courses are backed by their 20-day money-back guarantee. Here's a special limited-time deal for our listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only for our listeners at babbel.com/vulgar. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/vulgar, spelled BABBEL.com/vulgar. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Ah, the web tour. Those that both created and were created by the threads disentangle from the fringes to feast on the very thing that spawned them.
What's up, Tilly? This is how you deal with weird!
No! Do not harm my children!
Oh, you lost a feather. Can I keep it?
No, you can't force me to!
Do you know what lies within nothing?
Rocket's in trouble, Akasa! Can we turn on the windshield remotely?
No, she could lose her job as an Akasar.
I don't fear Vehar.
No, but you fear me. If you intend to trick me, I will not hesitate to sever the oath bond entirely.
Why didn't you help me? Coward! I don't have a parachute! I don't like free falling!
Counterbalance, a high fantasy audio drama. Season 2, coming 15th of October 2023. Learn more on trilunas.com.
Hello and welcome to Vulgar History, a feminist women's history comedy podcast. My name is Anne Foster, and today I'm bringing you an interview with author Claudia Cravens. So she's the author of a new novel that is called Lucky Red, which is a queer reimagining of the American Western genre. It's set in 1877 in Dodge City, and it's about a young girl named Bridget who winds up working there for a women-owned whorehouse, basically, and then she falls in love with a sharpshooter who's a really butch woman, and it's such a good book, and it's also really interesting. And when I read it, I was like, I need to talk to Claudia, I need to share this on the podcast, because it's just the way that she interrogates history, the way that she looks at sex work, the role of women in American history, but also looking at queer women in history. It's really interesting, and I was really excited to talk to her about it. So I hope you enjoy this interview with author Claudia Cravens about her debut novel, Lucky Red. So I'm joined today by Claudia Cravens, author of Lucky Red, which is a book I devoured. I think I just sat down to read it and I just read the whole thing all in one go, honestly. It was really good. I'm really excited to talk to you. Welcome, Claudia.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. And I'm so happy you enjoyed the book.
Yeah, I'm really excited to have you on the podcast to talk about it. I think I invited you before I'd even read the book, and then I read the book and I'm like, oh, I have so many questions. So first, can you just explain to everybody sort of, what's the elevator pitch? What's your book about?
Yeah, absolutely. Lucky Red is a queer feminist Western. Every Western features this hooker with a heart of gold whose job it usually is to help someone else, usually a man, have an adventure. And in Lucky Red, she gets to tell her own story in her own words. She falls in love with a badass lady bounty hunter. And then, when everything goes terribly wrong, she and her two best friends have no choice but to saddle up, ride out, and sort everybody out themselves.
I have to say, first of all, like women getting revenge is one of my favorite genres. So I was excited
It's
that element is there.
yeah, it's always a good time.
So set the scene. So it takes place in like the Wild West, like Dodge City. So did you draw from any, did you do any historical research to sort of like learn more about what life was like there?
Sort of, yeah. My research process is really from the ground up. My biggest priority when creating this historical setting was to make everything really feel real. So I worked very much from like the day-to-day sensory experiences that people would have and use that to build up. A lot of my research was around like the weather and the grass and what people were drinking and what it would taste like. And then a huge component of my research was about clothing. My mom is trained as a costume designer and has this encyclopedic knowledge of historical American clothing. So I asked her so many questions. I would like watch Westerns or do image searches or look at old advertisements and then send her in our text chain like a picture and be like, okay, what's the texture of this shirt? Like, is duck canvas the right word for these kind of pants and stuff like that? And so it was all of that like built up this wonderfully like detailed present world that I want. Because I mean, we live and die in the day to day, right? Like, that's where your whole life takes place in like the taste of your coffee and the way that your keys feel in your pocket and how your clothes fit. And so I looked for historical detail that would help all of that feel really real and then sort of worked my way up from there.
And so when you were first thinking of this story, I'm just curious, did it start from a character or did it start from a plot point or did it come from what you were saying? Like, well, the hooker with the heart of gold, what's her story? Like what was the first inspiration? Do you remember?
Yeah, the very first thing I created was the character of Spartan Lee, the lady bounty hunter. My original pitch to my best friend was okay, so like Han Solo, but like a really hot queer woman. Because I love the trope of the mysterious stranger and the like and the lovable scoundrel, you know. They're always so much fun, but they're almost always dudes, and why do they get to have all the fun? So I wanted to create that character as a queer woman. And then once I had Spartan Lee sort of kicking around in my brain, I was like, okay, whose life can she totally mess up? And then I sort of tried a few different configurations and then I landed with Bridget and it all just took off.
So tell everybody about Bridget, like who she is, how does she start the story off?
She's our plucky narrator protagonist. She starts the story off, she's 16. She's absolutely destitute. She takes care of her alcoholic father by just doing odd jobs around town in their hometown of Fort Smith, Arkansas. One day he comes home from a bender and is like, sweetheart, guess what? I traded our house for some land in the West, like, and this like rickety wagon. Let's go. And she's like, oh my God. Okay, sure. Whatever, fine. And so she starts out as this person who's like, she's very down on her luck. Things only go downhill from there for a while for Bridget and her father. He does not survive chapter one. She's down on her luck, been down on her luck pretty much her whole life, but she's got this like real stubbornness. In order to have even survived for as long as she has, to even make it to Dodge City, she has to be tough. She has to be scrappy. She has to have this sort of baseline optimism of like, maybe I can make this work. And so, you know, and like she's impulsive and she's got all this drive and she's got this basic insistence that she deserves to live. And that carries her forward all the way to Dodge City in chapter 2. And that's where she meets Lila, one of the madams of the Buffalo Queen brothel and saloon, which is a fictional brothel that I made up that is owned and operated by women. And the story really takes off from there.
So I really wanted to reading the book. I'm like, oh, I'm so interested to know about your take on this. So she becomes like she's working in a brothel, like she becomes a sex worker. And I really like the way that you approached that element of the book because, and I don't know, the word that occurred to me, it wasn't like, was kind of, I don't know, sex work neutral. It wasn't like, this is the greatest job she could have ever had, but it wasn't like this poor fallen woman. It's just kind of like, here's her job. And you approached it to me the same as if like she got a job as a farmhand or if she got a job in a laundry. It's just like, here's her job. And I found that refreshing and kind of, yeah.
I'm so happy to hear you say that because that is exactly how I wanted to approach it. Like, she and her fellow sex workers are people with jobs, and they're aware that they have a good version of a potentially bad job, but they are people with jobs. They're good at their jobs. They help each other. They're competent at their jobs. They're like, yeah, no different than farm hands or seamstresses or teachers or any other jobs that, I think those are just about the only three jobs that women could have had at the time, maybe homesteader's wife. But they're competent at it. They're good at their jobs. And that baseline competence also like just sort of drives a lot of how they interact and how they treat each other because they all at the end of the day have this vested interest in keeping the Buffalo Queen a safe and profitable place. Whenever there's conflict between the women, it always comes back down to like, okay, but we got to make this work because we got to work together. And I just really wanted to take that approach of like, it's work like anything else. Like it's a job, and Bridget immediately discovered she's good at it. She's like, okay, cool. Like, I'm good at this job and I've got plenty of food to eat and I get to hang out with like some cool women who I get along with. Like, great.
Yeah. Well, and then for her, like you were talking about the clothes and stuff too. Like when I was thinking about, what if this book was about someone who joined a laundry or something? Like there could have been similar plot points, but I think for Bridget going from such absolute destitution to suddenly a life of seeming glamour, I think there's something about
Mhm.
that too, where she's just like, oh, I don't just have a job and I'm being fed, but I have these like beautiful dresses. And, I get to sort of like live this, what ostensibly seems like sort of a fancier lifestyle.
Yeah, absolutely. Joining the Buffalo Queen is a major upgrade for Bridget. And she's really aware of that. One of the things that happens throughout the book is every time Bridget eats on screen, like she tells us exactly what she ate because it's delicious and plentiful and she's really into it. And she suddenly is wearing clothes that fit and look nice. And she like there's early in the book, there's a scene with her and Lila the madam, and where Lila's showing her how to do her face. And it's sort of the first time that she looks in the mirror and goes like, oh, I look good. And also like immediately understands how there's a certain power in that in her line of work. Um, and so yeah, it's all about like how she moves into this lifestyle that suddenly affords her like comfort and she's not going to sort of moral I think she's Bridget is a very practical character, so she's not going to like moralize herself out of a hot meal. The other thing I would say about the clothes is that there's a color story that follows Bridget all the way through, which is again like something I learned from my costumer mom of like Bridget starts out the story in faded light pink and then she moves into the bright red of the dresses that she wears when she's working at the Buffalo Queen. And then she ends the story in like black and purple. And then the madams always wear dark red, but it's sort of so it's this arc of like from naive to worldly, from passive to active. It's all sort of reflected there in the colors.
Oh, that's gorgeous. I didn't even notice that, but if I read it again, now I would. And actually, you just mentioned her naivete, and that was something else I wanted to tell you that I also really love when books do this. Two examples, like a book that I really love is I Capture the Castle by Dodie Smith. I don't know if you know that book, but it's similar to Atonement by Ian McEwan, where the main character is a young teenage girl and she misinterprets things. She doesn't understand what her own feelings mean. She doesn't understand like the romantic or sexual interactions of adult characters, often to detrimental effect. And so you're reading it as the reader, and you're just like, oh my God, no, you're misunderstanding this. But you're there with her and you understand that she doesn't get that. And your book has an element of that too, where I was just like, oh honey, oh no. Like part of that is just like her coming to understand her own queerness, right? And realizing, her experience of sex with men versus when she meets Spartan Lee and how that makes her feel. But then also her understanding of other people's motivations. She's very trusting, which comes to bite her in the butt later on. So I thought, for you as a writer, was it challenging to write? You knew the motivations of the characters, but she doesn't. So how did you balance that when you were writing it?
To be honest, you are giving me a little too much credit when you say that I know all of the motivations of the characters. For me, writing is really a discovery process.
Okay.
My brain is rarely more than 10 pages ahead of my keyboard. So like my process is, I write for a while and then I go, oh, well, that's not going to work. I need a new idea. And then I'll like outline a new idea and then write for a while and be like, oh, well, that's not going to work, and throw away that outline. So like I know some like far off plot points on the horizon, but like how we're going to get there, I have no idea. Which is fun. I mean, it's a really fun way to work. But I think like also for some of Bridget's naivete, I'm going to be totally honest, is drawn from life. I'm a pretty credulous person by nature. I tend to believe people are telling the truth as my default assumption, and that has had some consequences, but also brought incredible people into my life. There's pros and cons to every stance that you can take. But thinking about Bridget's naivete, I wanted us to go along with her on this emotional journey. And I was remembering that own time in my life. Bridget's discovery of her own feelings and her own desires is the part of the book, or part of the story, that is definitely the most drawn from my own experience of just falling in love for the first time, and not with the person that I expected, and how that sort of rippled out through my whole life, and the ways that like part of what Bridget's naivete lets her do is to, like really follow her heart. I think there are these times in life when what's really in your heart, like really, it has to come out. You have no other choice but to be yourself. And I wanted to give Bridget that gift of like, you have no choice but to do what your heart is telling you to do. It's like, this has to happen, baby. And, and I think in order to make that happen, like some of that does have to come from a certain innocence, a certain naivete. Like if she was as savvy as the Madams or as educated as her best friend Constance, I don't think she would have been able to wind up with Spartan Lee. I don't think she would have been able to take that plunge. And so like her naivete was also a great tool for me. It sort of opened up some doors of like, okay, if you are not suspicious of every new person you meet, if you are not necessarily looking for hidden motives, you can kind of just barrel forward, and like until things go wrong, they go really great.
No, exactly. And I think my impression of her is she sort of stumbles into this work, but it turns out she's good at it. And then she feels, growing up, it was her and her dad, and it was this kind of toxic situation. And then suddenly she has friends and a sense of community and a sense of family. And she's like, this is great. My life is great. What could go wrong?
Yeah.
Like she's not suspicious, wondering what's behind the next door. She's just like, this is good. I can stay here forever. Like there's a part in the book, I don't think this is spoilery, where she's sort of offered the chance to leave, and she's like, why would I ever do that? Like, no, of course not. Like, it's great here. And now we're just going to take a break for a word from our sponsors.
As a podcast network, our first priority has always been audio and the stories we're able to share with you. But at Realm, we also sell some pretty cool merch, and organizing that was made both possible and easy with Shopify. When you think about successful businesses like Aloe or Allbirds or Skims, an often overlooked secret is the business behind the business that makes selling and, for shoppers, buying simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. That's because nobody does selling better than Shopify. It's the home of the #1 checkout on the planet. And the not-so-secret secret that's definitely worth talking about is that Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%. That's more happy customers and way more sales going. If you're hoping to grow your business, your commerce platform better be ready to sell wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling, on the web, in your store, in their feed, and everywhere in between. Businesses that sell more sell on Shopify. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout we use with Shopify. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/realm, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/realm to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/realm.
Hi, this is Rob Benedict.
And I am Richard Spate. We were both on a little show you might know called Supernatural.
It had a pretty good run, 15 seasons, 327 episodes.
And though we have seen, of course, every episode many times, we figured, hey, now that we're wrapped, let's watch it all again.
And we can't do that alone. So we're inviting the cast and crew that made the show along for the ride. We've got writers, producers, composers, directors, and we'll of course have some actors on as well, including some certain guys that played some certain pretty iconic brothers.
It was kind of a little bit of a left field choice in the best way possible.
The note from Kripke was, he's great, we love him, but we're looking for like a really intelligent Duchovny type.
With 15 seasons to explore, it's going to be the road trip of several lifetimes. So please join us and subscribe to Supernatural Then and Now.
People often look at me with confusion when I ask them what their only one in the room story is. They think it has to be like mine, where I went to a 600-person event and discovered that I was the only Black person there. I know. Horrifying, right? Hi, I'm Laura Cathcart-Robbins, and I am the host and creator of the podcast Only One in the Room. Every week, my co-host Scott Slaughter and I invite you to join us for an hour and lose yourself in someone's only one story. This podcast is for anyone who has ever felt alone in a room full of people, which is to say that this podcast is for everyone.
I'm Brennan Storr.
I'm Paul Bestall.
We're the Ghost Story Guys.
And every 2 weeks, we explore first-person stories of encounters with the paranormal from all around the world.
Then we have some fun reacting to those stories. We like to say our goal is to scare the hell out of you, then make you laugh.
Belief in the paranormal is not required. All you need is a love of great storytelling and curiosity about the world around you.
Come find the Ghost Story Guys on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else fine podcasts live, or at ghoststoryguys.com.
And we're back.
Yeah, and I know the scene you mean, and somebody asks her, like, well, but how do you feel about this work? And she's like, that's such a childish question. I'm well fed, I'm warm, I'm with my friends. Like, it has never occurred to me to wonder whether I like it. Like, obviously, this is great.
Which I think, again, gets to the, like, what I was calling the sex work neutrality. She's just like, this is my job, whatever. Which I think is, especially in the Pantheon, I don't know a lot about Western movies. It's not a genre I watch a lot, but I watched things growing up like Dr. Quinn, Medicine Woman, where like there was a brothel and there's a character there who eventually falls in love with a man and then she leaves the brothel. So it's kind of like the narrative that I'm familiar with is that, or like, I've not read this book or seen this movie, but I know Redeeming Love by Francine Rivers is like a very famous Christian novel about a sex worker who is like redeemed by the love of a good man. Like, it seems to me like that's often, it just came out as a movie very recently. But it seems to me like that's one of the narratives maybe, is that somebody's in this job, but if they're a good person, they're going to ultimately leave it, you know? And in your book, you're showing like, no, she's like, quote unquote, a good person. I mean, I think, again, it's a very neutral, objective book, but the fact that that's not her goal, she's not like, well, I'll just do this until I'll save enough money so I can leave. Like, that's never her thing. She's just like, I'm in this job and it's fine. And to me, that felt kind of revolutionary.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, I that was really important to me, to not have her waiting to be saved from sex work. You know, I think, as you alluded to before, there's these sort of two stereotypes of sex workers, especially in historical fiction, where they're either like the fallen woman who sort of like coughs into a handkerchief, and then there's like the rootin' tootin' happy hooker. And those, I'm sure that people absolutely live their lives in those personas as well. But I feel like a lot of it would have just been like, they're well compensated professionals. And there is like, okay, so I'm not a historian, and my research process, because it's so ground up, is also somewhat chaotic. But one of the things I bumped up against a few times was that, like, especially for women at this time who were doing like higher end sex work, like the disdain between them and quote unquote respectable women was mutual. That they were like, okay, so you're married and you can like go out in society and everybody respects you. And that seems very nice for you, sweetheart. But I have my own money and my own life. And you're also having sex for bed and board, but your trick owns you body and soul. I am a free agent, and and like there's obviously, that's an unbelievable simplification. Obviously, like, sex work is complex, marriage is complex, the roles of women in the US and US history are very complex. But there was this touch of like women who are doing higher end sex work being like, why would we want to be you?
And I think that conversation, I think there's a moment in your book where somebody mentions, it's like what you just said. Sort of, I think one of the sex worker characters mentions is like, yeah, well, why would I want to just, it's like doing sex work, but for one person, and I'm much better compensated staying here.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a scene where Bridget's best friend Constance takes her shopping in town, and Constance is a little closer to a fallen woman. She was well educated, she was married and is now widowed, and came to sex work as a widow looking to survive. And there's a scene where Constance takes Bridget shopping in town, and they encounter some respectable women who shun them and shame them very publicly. And Constance is really upset. And Bridget sort of drags her away, drags her back towards the Buffalo Queen. And she says basically, like, what do they have that we lack except for noses to wipe and shirts to mend and runner beans to put up before the fall? Like, and then basically Bridget is like, giving Constance a lesson in like how not to give a fuck. And yeah, and it's very much like, what do they have that you want, girl? Like,
No, exactly. And that's what I found, again, just refreshing in your book, that it's not, well, I think Bridget is just coming into this from a very, I think you said, like a very pragmatic point of view. She's just like, here's my job. Great. I'm doing this job. I have food. I'm good. Like, she's not coming into it with the preconceptions of those higher society women, or maybe somebody who had been in a different, like Constance. And that's a really good example of somebody who has sort of she's absorbed those cultural concepts because she knows how people from another echelon view their work. So I don't know, I just found it really refreshing. And even in your book, like there's in other sorts of works written by somebody else, there might have been like, oh no, a pregnancy scare, or like an abortion gone wrong, or whatever. And your book is just kind of like, I'm sure, birth control and pregnancy scares and abortions are happening, but it's kind of like, but they're good. They're handling it. They know what to do. Like, let's move on. And I appreciated that also.
oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Those are definitely like things that I thought about a lot and did some research on, and sort of poked her and like sort of thought about like, how do I want this to be a part of the story? And at the end of the day, I was like, I just really want to focus on how they are pros. They know what they're doing. And so it's worked in early on as Lila the Madam saying to Bridget, like, you know how to tell if you're pregnant. If you are, let us know. The sooner the better. We will figure it out. But like that it's like it's priced in as a cost of doing business, that this might happen.
No, and yeah, I remember that part of the story, and I'm like, okay, it's like, you've covered your bases, and I'm like, that's fine. Like, that's not what the story's about. And I do want to bring back, we've been talking a lot about her work, and that's really interesting to me. But the first thing you said, like the first idea, like the first spark of an idea for this book was Spartan Lee. So I want to talk about that character as well. This like lady bounty hunter, queer female Han Solo love interest. So what when you were writing that character, were you able to draw, like, what sort of historical precedents were you looking at, or were you more looking at the sort of concept of like this character in a Western and approaching it from that direction?
I started with the concept. Spartan Lee is basically like a fantasy. I created her from a position of like just pure queer girl fantasy land of like, here comes this like gorgeous, capable, badass butch woman who's just going to turn your whole life upside down. I really built it from there. You know, Spartan Lee, like, is sort of the most archetypal character in the whole story. She's very, you know, she's the mysterious stranger who rides into town. So I started with that simple but very potent trope of a character. And I was just like, but you know what? Let's make her a girl and just let it ride and see what happens.
Mm-hmm. And it's a great name, by the way, Spartan Lee. Oh my God.
Oh, thank you so much. I plucked it out of the ether.
Yeah. No, it's the same sort of like archetypal, sort of like iconic name that a male character might have had in a similar sort of Western story, I think. Yeah. And so their relationship to each other is obviously like a large part of the book as well. And how that helps Bridget sort of develop and grow as a person. And then I'm not going to get into the whole third act of the book and the the revenge angle, but just like know that Bridget does learn how to shoot a gun and it comes in handy. So when you were thinking about it, were you the whole like, bury your gaze trope and stuff, like was that something that you were concerned with the, the two characters? I don't want you to reveal like do they have a happy ending or not, but just like was that something you were thinking about, like to have a tragic story versus not a tragic story and what that could mean?
Yeah, I definitely, and yeah, I'm going to try to thread the needle of like not spoiling, but also this is something that I've thought a lot about and really thought about in the course of writing the book because bury your gaze is such a trope. It's so Hays Code. It's so like pay for your immoral behavior, like old school bullshit. Um, I think for me, what I kept front and center as I was thinking about the plot and as I was thinking in particular about the relationship between Bridget and Spartan Lee was I knew that everything had to be taking Bridget towards total agency. Everything had to be taking Bridget towards feeling like the master of her fate, feeling like she was the one who could decide the course of her life and what she wanted to have happen and how that was going to happen. And so every choice that I made about their relationship was all just sort of like what's going to make Bridget feel the most like herself, whether that's winding up together in a happy ending or something else happening. It was all about like what's going to make Bridget the most fulfilled and powerful and filled with agency and a sense of self.
And your book is written, I believe, in the past tense, first person past tense. Am I remembering correctly?
Mhm.
Yeah. So, which I will sometimes find reassuring to know that like this character is going to be okay because she sort of she alludes a couple times vaguely to
Yeah.
like, oh, I met some people, and I'm like, okay, she's going to go on and have further adventures. Like Bridget, it's like, okay, she's going to be okay. Which, again, personally, I find reassuring to know about a main character. But
Mhm.
yeah, and just there's so many things in the book. Like it's primarily a Western. There is a love story in it. It's not a romance novel by any means. So I think, yeah, so in terms of the expectations for the ending, it would be different if this was, just a love story. But that's kind of one element of a bigger thing. But yeah, I was wondering as I was getting more towards the end of the book, I was just like, what's gonna happen to these characters? And I'm like, oh my gosh, that must have been such a huge thing for Claudia to consider. Like just telling this queer story and how it's gonna land.
And I thought a lot about like how is this going to land, because it's a Western first and foremost. Westerns are always about like who the protagonist really is. And so every choice that I made, especially in the third act, was all about like, okay, what's going to make Bridget the most Bridget? What's the most Bridget thing she could do right now? Just every step of the way.
Mhm. The supporting character, I just wanted to give a little shout out to this one character. Is her name Sally, the one who arrives a bit later? That's her name? Or
Yeah.
yeah. I love a bitch character. And Sally sweeps it to this book and she's bringing us to this like Amy March from Little Women sort of energy where I was just like, oh,
Yes.
oh, I enjoy this. So I like that you've got that as well. It's not like Bridget comes into this world and everyone at the Buffalo Queen is like nice and kind and helpful and supportive. It's like, no, there's people there with all different kinds of personalities, but I don't know. This is what I'm saying. It's like I love a revenge book. I love a book where the main character is naive and misinterprets something kind of terribly, and I love a bitch character, so I was just like, "Oh, this book is everything for me."
Oh, I'm so happy to hear that. Yeah, yeah. Someone's got to be a bitch. And not because it's a house full of women, but because it's a workplace. Like there is a version of Lucky Red that's basically a workplace comedy, and so like somebody's got to be difficult. But then it always spins back to that issue, that competence of like Sally's a bitch, but she's really good at her job.
Mhm, mhm.
Um,
No, exactly, and
and
yeah.
Lila's really tough, but she's an amazing boss.
Exactly, and then you were saying, like, how at the end of the day, it's like they all know that they need this business to succeed because that's how they can keep themselves getting paid and keep themselves living pretty
Mhm.
decently. So even if exactly, like, in any workplace, it's like, well, we might not all always get along or like each other, but here's like, we gotta work together.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they gotta live together.
Yeah, yeah. So there's that element as well. I don't know, it just there's so many fun and interesting things about this book. I think I don't know, for me, again, I'm just, like, sitting here flattering your book, which I hope makes you feel good.
Oh,
But, like
thank you so much. Yeah, I love it. Let's talk
Oh,
all day.
exactly. Yeah, but I think that you were like, it's an ambitious thing you're doing, but it goes down so easy. Like I said, like, I was reading it and I wasn't being like, "Oh," making points to, like, have an academic discussion with you. I was just like, "Hell yeah." Like, "What's gonna happen next?" Like, it's just, like, so readable and fun, which I think is what Westerns are. Like, that's what they're supposed to be. Like, that's why people love
Yeah.
them, right?
They're supposed to be so fun, and I'm so glad you had a good time because, like, that was the main thing I was going for. I was like, I wrote a book I wanted to read. I love awesome stories about cool people doing amazing shit. Like,
Mhm.
that's what I like. So, that's what I wanted to create, and I wanted it to feel real and lively, and so I'm so glad that that's the experience you had. And yeah, and westerns are such a fun genre. I mean, and I'm not here to apologize for like John Wayne movies or anything like that. Like it's also a highly problematic genre with, capital P, and there's a lot of issues, but it's also like at the center of it, there's this really fun tension to play with where there's this huge scope for massive emotional arcs. People can discover who they really are and fall in love with for the first time and like seek true catharsis through vengeance and like all of these amazing huge arcs. But then it's in tension with this very, very demanding physical reality where like, okay, cool, yeah, you can achieve like total self-actualization, but if you don't know how to ride a horse and build a fire and shoot a gun, you're going to be in trouble like today. And I love that tension, and that is what I feel like is really at the heart of westerns is this tension between huge emotional landscapes and then a physical landscape that's like, yeah, but I'm full of snakes and they're poisonous.
No, exactly. So it's yeah. It's such a fun genre like that like you said, there's other problems historically with this genre, but just like
For
inherently at
sure.
its core, like
Yes.
that's a really fun area to play around in. And your book, this podcast is coming out, I think I forget if it's like what day is your book published?
June 20th.
Yeah, so this podcast is coming out like the week that it's published. So by the time people are listening to this, they can go buy a copy of it, whatever. And do you have a website or social media where people can follow? Because I'm sure you're going to have events and things that week.
Yeah, absolutely. You can find me at claudiacravens.com or on Twitter at Claudia_Cravens. Or if you also want to see pictures of my very cute dog, you can find me on Instagram at Claudia.Cravens.
So, I mean, again, it's funny because I'm talking to you before the book comes out, but this is coming out when the book comes out. But I'll just say, like, best of luck with the launch and everything. Is it coincidental or intentional that the book is coming out during Pride Month?
Yeah, no, it's intentional. We wanted it to be a part of the Pride celebration.
Well, and I think it's, again, like just the fact that it's such a fun, interesting book, I think really adds to the landscape of queer literature. I don't know, it's
Thank
a
you.
weird, interesting new voice that I think I hope lots of people come to read this book.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, I hope everybody who reads it really enjoys it. And my big hope for the book is that anybody who's ever been told that you need to put what your heart is telling you behind good sense, I hope that all of those people find some kinship with Bridget and feel seen.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today. And I mean, best of luck with the book launch week event that is, again, as people hear this, currently happening.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me.
So after hearing that interview, I have to assume you all want to go out immediately and read this book. And guess what? You can, because it was just released this week. And so you can read it. There's a book, audiobook, ebook. You can get it from anywhere where you normally get books from, including your local public library, potentially. And if you buy it using the link that's in the show notes at bookshop.org, then a little bit of money goes to support this podcast. But honestly, it's such a good book. Like I said in the interview, I read it all in one sitting. It's just so propulsively interesting and fun and feminist and good. So, Lucky Red by Claudia Cravens. You shall read it. And if you want to keep up with me and this podcast, I'm on Instagram at Vulgar History Pod. I'm on TikTok at Vulgar History. I also have a Patreon, which is at patreon.com/AnnFosterWriter. So there, if you pledge at least $1 a month, then you get early ad-free access to all episodes of this podcast. And if you pledge at least $5 a month, then you get the early ad-free access, as well as access to Patreon exclusive bonus episodes. And I also have merch for sale at vulgarhistory.com/store is the TeePublic store. And then if you go, that's best for people in the US, as I understand it, in terms of shipping costs. If you live outside of the US, then sounds like it's better to go through the Redbubble store, which is vulgarhistory.redbubble.com. And we've got some new designs there, including some that are reclaiming some insults people gave me in reviews of my podcast. One of them says very biased, which I am. And another design says rambling and unscholarly, which debatably I could be. But anyway, so those are all there in the merch store. If you want to leave a nice review to counterbalance people who call me things like rambling and unscholarly, feel free to leave a review on Apple Podcasts, or now if you're listening on Spotify, when you're in each episode, there's a place where you can leave comments there as well. And anyway, thank you so much for listening to the podcast. Until next time, keep your pants on and your tits out. Vulgar History is hosted, written, and researched by Ann Foster and edited by Christina Lumagi.
Welcome to the small town of Chinook, where faith runs deep and secrets run deeper. In this new thriller, religion and crime collide when a gruesome murder rocks the isolated Montana community. Everyone is quick to point their fingers at a drug-addicted teenager, but local deputy Ruth Vogel isn't convinced. She suspects connections to a powerful religious group. Enter federal agent V.B. Lauro, who has been investigating a local church for possible criminal activity. The pair form an unlikely partnership to catch the killer, unearthing secrets that leave Ruth torn between her duty to the law, her religious convictions, and her very own family. But something more sinister than murder is afoot, and someone is watching Ruth.
Chinook, starring Kelly Marie Tran and Sanaa Lathan. Listen to Chinook wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi, I'm Jennifer, a founder of the Go Kid Go network. At Go Kid Go, putting kids first is at the heart of every show that we produce. That's why we're so excited to introduce a brand new show to our network called The Search for the Silver Lining, a fantasy adventure series about a spirited young girl named Isla who time travels to the mythical land of Camelot. Look for The Search for the Silver Lining on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts.